The Federal Reserve, who has been at the center of the financial crisis, giving out money to corporations all over the world, has decided to play the game of lyrical wordsmith, while simultaneously saying there is, quote, relatively weak growth. They suggest they will raise the interest rates twice in 2016. Rising interest rates will make it impossible to pay back the national debt, impossible for businesses to borrow more money, and impossible for individuals to pay off their adjustable rate mortgages. The clock is ticking. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we will get into what the Fed has said. In fact, they had a meeting, and it was Janet the Felon Yellen, we had Helicopter Ben Bernanke, and also Paul Volcker. Let's look at this. Economists shaved already weak growth forecasts by a few more tenths Friday after wholesale inventories fell 0.5%, and it goes on. Now, when I read this type of information, you see these minute percentages, and they make such a big deal about it in the news. What's important to note is what I highlighted here. And remember this GDP now statistic. And I just covered the fact that it was 0.4%, and already it's revised down again to 0.1%. So basically no growth whatsoever. And this is what we'll have to get used to. But if spending increases because of Obamacare, for example, or new tax is introduced somehow, some way, then they can say that the GDP statistics have gone up. They used this with Obamacare, where they said the GDP in a particular quarter went up 5%. But really, all of that was the contributions toward Obamacare when they first introduced it. So it's really a scam the way that they try to pull this on us. And at the bottom, I'm not going to read it for you, but basically it just says like, look, we weren't expecting this to happen, and it was a little bit worse than it happened. We expected 0.4296%, and instead it was 0.134562 to the quarter of pi. And they go on to all these ridiculous things. And people read this in the financial industry, and they really take it as it's important. And this is the kind of thing that I have to deal with every day. But read it for yourselves if you're interested. But look for the real information. This is a joke when you read this kind of thing. What I'm trying to just say here is that the real economy is down. And when you introduce new taxation or new whatever you want to call it, something like an Obamacare, and people are forced to spend more money, not on houses and cars and things like this, but actually to get their health care or to get it, whatever it is, pay for roads or anything, then it's a whole different ball game we're playing in. Now look at this. We're looking at that meeting I was discussing, and Paul Volcker admitted he saw some, quote, overextended pieces of the financial system. He concurred, saying he does not believe a bubble exists. That's right. Yellen said there is no bubble in the U.S. economy, and the labor market is healing. That's right. Yeah. This is the kind of propaganda where they have to come down, they sit around, they talk, say a few things, all the financial analysts are watching, and they really take it word for word. Yellen added that the global economy has seen relatively weak growth despite positive signs in the U.S. The Fed has taken a cautious approach to raising interest rates. So, they raised interest rates back in December, a minuscule amount, the absolute minimum amount they could, and this is really just to save face. Actually, the economy couldn't handle it, but, here we are. Yellen said she did not consider December to be a mistake, and she said that it was showing substantial progress towards the Fed's labor market and inflation goals. That's right. When you have a terrible labor market and actually bad inflation in the real indicators, not the ones that they use for their core inflation statistic, but, let's ignore those. She noted that the Fed would, quote, watch very carefully what is happening in the economy. No, they won't. They'll ignore all the real information and they'll go with this skewed statistics. That's just the way it is. Now, look at a country that has failed over and over again for the past few decades. Japan to print additional 10,000 yen bills as more people stash their cash at home. The finance ministry plans to increase the number of 10,000 yen bills in circulation amid signs that more people are hoarding cash. They have introduced negative interest rates, the response of which has been people are taking their money out of the bank and stuffing it under their mattresses. People don't have the sophistication to be able to find investments. They don't want to look for real estate. They don't want to buy gold and silver. They know cash. That's what they're used to. So they take the cash and they stuff it under the mattress, and they believe that this is the best way to, mitigate all of the dangers of the financial system. I don't agree with this policy, but this is what they're doing. So we need to realize what happens if those negative interest rates continue to decline. Well, obviously, we're going to have a big problem down the line. Japan is just one very good example. But of course, if you talk to anyone in the financial industry, Japan is the prime example for why QE works. This is the fraud. Auditor, government will owe more money than the entire economy produces. This does not scare people who are invested in stocks. This does not scare people who are in the political realm or in the financial as well. Report finds issues with the reliability of government's financial statements and improper payments when you use generally accepted accounting principles. This is the rules that any corporation has to follow for what they put on their books. But if you use that gap principle towards the US government, for example, we're looking at an absolute minimum, and this is a very, very soft estimate, and that is $100 trillion of debt. Where in the world are they going to get the money to pay that back? And the fact that is they cannot do so. And, they audit them relatively on occasion, the Government Accountability Office, and they have some good information to say usually, but essentially in the next few years, the federal government will owe more money than the entire economy produces. What does that tell you about the strength of the economy? Well, that there is none. In my book, I talked about, number one, interest rates and how when you raise interest rates, I talked about the different scenarios, but what I want to highlight here is raising interest rates, governments would have to pay more on the interest payments on their national debt. What does that tell you about the situation? It doesn't take a genius. Christine Lagarde from the IMF insists it is simply nonsense that the IMF is pushing for a credit crisis to force the economic reforms in Greece, responding to a leaked conversation that sparked a fury among the country's politicians. So WikiLeaks leaked this transcript about the IMF saying that they need to cause a crisis, therefore they can basically push Greece into making some, let's call it, serious headway. She said in a letter to the Greek Prime Minister, the IMF conducts its negotiations in good faith, not by way of threats. We do not communicate through leaks. So, when you have this IMF, what they intend on doing every single time is to forcefully create a crisis. You take a small crisis and make it a really big crisis so that they can come in and decide the rules. And they have done so already in Greece, but they want to extend it. They want to take everything. I thought, perhaps they were done raping and pillaging everything Greece had, but that's not over yet. And we'll see this as time goes on. In China, a lot of people say that China is liberalizing, and in many ways they are, getting rid of a lot of those controls that they have over the state. Look at this. China is rolling out a nationwide system of social control known as, quote, grid management. I thought this had something to do with the power lines, but apparently not. In a revival of state presence in the residential life that had receded as society liberalized during the recent decades, from smog-blanketed towns in the North China to the politically sensitive Tibetan capital, small police booths and networks of citizens have been set up block by block to reduce neighborhood disputes, enforce sanitation, reduce crime and keep an eye on anyone deemed to be a troublemaker. So think about this. This is the 1984 world. This is Big Brother, and it's being set up in China to an even better degree than it was before. You always had this, and every country does. This is the police state. And this is 1984, it's Big Brother. But now with technology, they can take it to a different level. See, the powers that be didn't envision the technology with the microphones and all of the NSA powers and everything else at that time. But now today they have that, and they are using that. So they're going to enforce all of these rules. Maybe it's you're jaywalking across the street. Next thing you know, you're in jail, and you basically find yourself unable to find work when you get out, and all this kind of thing. It connects all the way down the line. But it's not just China who's doing this. This is just one example. You can see that the debtor's prison situation, you can see all of these different countries going towards this type of system where they have CCTV set up on every single street corner, but it's not to get the real criminals. The real criminals always get away with the activities they are engaged in. If it's some sort of big corporation, they get a little slap on the wrist, a couple $1 million fine, and everything is just fine. And in Brazil, just something important to note here, Brazil's drawn-out political crisis is moving into a decisive phase next week with 2 key votes in Congress that could seal the fate of President Dilma Rousseff's political future. So basically, they want to impeach her, and whether or not they will obviously we'll be covering it here. But all I wanted to note is that when somebody does something criminal, and it doesn't matter if they're a president, if they're the head of the IMF or the UN or anything else, they need to be kicked out of their position. They'll be replaced by another puppet, but it goes to show you how powerful we can truly be, the people. But of course, it doesn't really happen too often, but this is something that has been positive. Whether Obama was able to get impeached, that never got any traction. In fact, in many ways, just improved his power after the NDAA was signed. Even though he should have been impeached on the spot, his overlords gave him the authority to do so. That's why it was signed in. It wasn't signed in for King Obama, Emperor Obama, to have that power. It's actually for any president to have the powers of detainment and torture and everything else. That's what the NDAA is all about, and that was signed in, wasn't impeached. Nobody really talked about it. It was briefly mentioned in the news, and that's pretty much it. And today it's just, another thing, another law that's been put into place. That's it for me. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up. Last but not least, if you found the video informative, I know you'll find my book, The Money GPS, even more informative. You can actually look through the book. If you go over to Amazon, they have a look inside feature, which will allow you to flip through the pages of the book and see if you like it. Take care.